Making Comics 101, Issue 3, World Building. Greetings, people of the internet. I'm Scott with Serkworks Art Labs. Welcome, mad creators, to the underground laboratory where together we are going to create some awesome comics, because this is Making Comics 101 and this is issue 3. We're going to talk about world building, the dreaded world building. Now, I don't say that because it's not fun to world build. For a lot of people, that's the funnest part. But that's sort of the problem, is a lot of people just get caught up in the whole world building process that they never really get around to making a comic. And sometimes we use world building as a way to make it seem like we're being productive, but really we're not getting to the task at hand. We're not getting to actually creating that comics. And some people will just spend years building the landscapes and the characters and the worlds. So I just want to really stress this. Just please proceed with caution in your world building, because the goal here is to actually create a comic. Now, this is especially important for beginning artists. I think seasoned professionals and everything, people that have made comics before, tons of comics, I think some of the folks who have a lot of comics under their belt, world building is really not going to be a problem, because it's just that big hurdle to get over. It's that getting that initial comic out. Once you do that, then you kind of know you can do it. But I think a lot of times, many of us, when we're beginning, we use the world building process as just something to, I guess, satiate us in lieu of getting that comic, completed or even started. So I am going to talk about world building, but I just want to put that caveat there, that warning out there. Don't get too caught up on this, especially if it's your first time. I would recommend skipping a lot of that, creating a very simple story to begin with if it's your first time. And we talked about a lot of this in a previous episode on getting started. You can go back and check that out. And that kind of leads me to something that I want to mention. These videos here, there's certain order, but you can jump in pretty much anywhere you want depending on what you want to learn about. So maybe world building is your thing and you're just tuning into this and I've already created comics. Maybe you don't need to learn how to start making a comics, or maybe you're really good at ideas. You don't need ideas with coming up with comics, so you don't need to watch those episodes. Or you can start from the beginning and watch them all the way through. It's kind of up to you. That's what this whole course is about. So getting into world building, the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to world building are the rules. Now, when I say rules, you may be like, wait a minute, I'm making a comic. Can I just do whatever I want? Can I create whatever worlds I want? Can I create whatever characters I want? It's my world after all. Can't I pretty much create anything I want to? And the answer to that is more or less, yes, you can. But what I'm talking about as far as rules are rules that you establish in your world, because you can tell almost any kind of story you want. You can make it as outlandish as possible, as unbelievable as possible, as long as you establish that up front. But if you start telling like a serious story and all of a sudden people are like jumping out of buildings and surviving and crazy things that might happen like in an action movie, but it just doesn't make sense if your story is more grounded in reality. But if you are telling this crazy shoot 'em up action story where just crazy things happen and people are shooting all over it at our hero and he never gets shot, sure, that's unbelievable, but if we establish that from the beginning, then people will roll with that and your audience isn't going to be like, wait, this is kind of weird. So just know that going in. A perfect example of this might be like, Star Wars. Star Wars is a great example of world building because the world in Star Wars is just expansive. I mean, it just goes on forever with all the different characters and different landscapes and worlds. Speaking of world building, I mean, there are so many different planets and star systems and everything in Star Wars, and the lore with the Force and all this kind of stuff. You would think with something as expansive as Star Wars, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can introduce any kind of character you want. But think about this: if somebody was to introduce a character and they're like, yeah, I'm so and so, I am from Earth, you're gonna step back and be like, well, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, all these planets out there, why would it be weird if one of them happens to be Earth? But it would be, because they've never really established that. This story takes place in a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. We don't know what that would be in relation to Earth, how long ago it was, if this would be before the Earth was created or before dinosaurs, whatever the case is. We don't really know that, but it would just seem very odd if we were to introduce the location of Earth in our Star Wars story. Whereas a story like another sci-fi story, Battlestar Galactica, it's not weird at all to have Earth in the story, because they've established that for the beginning, that's pretty much what they're looking for is Earth. A lot of people, when they start world building, will option to sort of go with this sort of sandbox idea where anything can happen. I can throw anything in there just to cover all my bases. So anything down the road I can introduce. And there are a few stories that are just so wacky that you can make sense doing that. But I would argue with even those type of stories, there are certain things that aren't going to make sense if you introduce them. So keep that in mind when you're world building. You don't want to lose your audience. You want them to be with you for the duration of your story. So when you're establishing the parameters of your world, keep that in mind and try not to stray from that too much. Even though I encourage you to create these rules for your world, I don't want you to feel like you're locked down. I mean, you can be, but there are certain ways that creatively you can write your way out of, like, if you put yourself sort of a pickle with some of these rules. But again, that's something that you really have to think about. Now, we do live in the age of like reboots. I mean, it seems real prevalent now, but it's not necessarily a new thing. Take for instance James Bond. James Bond has had a number of different actors play that role, and each actor kind of brings his own take to the character. So whereas Sean Connery portrayed James Bond in a certain way, once he left the franchise and the next film was on Her Majesty's Secret Service, George Lazenby, I think he only did the one film, but he took over and it was a different take, and it was almost like a reboot, almost to the point where I think when he was introduced, they went through the whole action, like the intro with the whole action scene and everything, and then I think it involved a ski slope and he skis down, and then he kind of turns to the camera and pretty much breaks the fourth wall like Deadpool style and says, "This wouldn't happen to the other guy." So, I mean, that pretty much sets you up that this is a different kind of James Bond. So there are different things that you can do, and as long as you can get the audience on board and everything, you might be able to go a different way with your story. So something to think about. But for the most part, once you establish your world and everything, you really don't want to stray from that too much. But really, you can get as crazy as you want. When you look at like superheroes or like, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, these characters are doing crazy stuff too. In the beginning, when they first started making superheroes and translating them into film, a lot of the filmmakers, they weren't really comic fans, and they was like, well, you can't do that, that'd just be stupid, or have characters in tights or whatever. It's not going to work. And then they would try to change things, and it just didn't resonate with fans until they started doing things pretty much as close as you could to the comic. Now, some things change. I know some of the costumes don't necessarily translate onto screen, and the costumes are, you know, they can't do them exactly. I mean, some of them they can, like Spider-Man's pretty accurate, or different versions of Spider-Man, and he's basically a guy in tights, so they can do it. But even though superheroes are, you know, something it's unbelievable. You couldn't believe this in a real world setting, and they tried to make it realistic. In some ways they've succeeded, some ways not so much, or they try to make it too realistic and it just doesn't have the fun of the comic. But it's believable in that world, in that Marvel Cinematic Universe. You can believe pretty much anything, you know, superpowers and things, just because they're very smart about how they introduce new things, and you kind of have to be the same way. Indiana Jones is another movie franchise that just, Indiana Jones can do some crazy things. I mean, he doesn't have superpowers or anything like that, but they've kind of established that he can do some things that just, you know, anyone else would pretty much die. Now, there's a scene in the most recent film, The Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls. I know that one gets a lot of flack, and it is definitely problematic, but I don't hate it as much as a lot of people. And I have to kind of be careful what I say, because it's definitely a divisive film. But there's a scene in the more recent film where the refrigerator blows up and Indiana Jones go flying and everything, and people just did not believe that could happen. You know, this is just going too far. But where's the line drawing too far? Because to me, in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, he jumps out of an airplane with a rubber raft and basically parachutes down from there. So, I mean, to me, that pretty much set out and established that this is a crazy world. I mean, he's human, but he can do crazy stuff and survive it. So, because of that, I wasn't as taken aback by the whole refrigerator thing, and I know I'm in the minority on that. But all this is to say that, you know, have fun when you're creating your worlds, and you can get as crazy, outlandish, fanciful as you want, as long as you establish that in the beginning. So when you're building your world, set up the rules and sort of stick to those rules. A few other things we want to consider when we are world building is time. What time frame does your story take place in? Does it take place in the past? Does it take place in the present or the future? And once you've established sort of what that time is, assuming that if you do have a story that takes place in the real world in the past, then you need to do a little bit of research to find out, what were some of the events that were happening around all this time? What was the feeling like? What was the atmosphere? What were people going through? There's a lot of things to consider as far as the time frame you put it in. If your story takes place in the present, well, that's a little bit easier. You just kind of look around. There's not a lot of digging and doing a lot of research, and it's a little easier to get things a little more accurate. There's been a lot of media that it takes place in a certain time, and at the time that's just what was going on, but then when you look back at it, it's almost like a time capsule of that era in time. So some of the things that you might want to include if you're doing a modern story, whether it's slang people are using, if you look at like a movie like Clueless or Fast Times or a lot of these teen dramas and everything, a lot of the language and stuff that they use, that was the language of the time, but now when you look back and you watch it, it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely in the 80s or this is in the 90s. So there's certain films that just encapsulate that time. So when you are introducing things into your story, if it's a story told in the present, those are some of the things that you may want to consider if you don't want it to seem out of date, or maybe you're not concerned about that. Maybe you want that to feel, even if your story lives on past the present, maybe you want people to know, oh, this was definitely a story that was told, in around 2019, 2020, that time period. If your story takes place in the future, now, usually when I tell a story in the future, I like to tell it so far in the future that, I try not to reference too much stuff that's going on now, because a lot of this, when you're trying to predict the future, a lot of things they don't happen, and then it can seem really dated. If you look back at like Back to the Future 2, I mean, what was it? Was like Jaws 19 or something? Okay, we had 5 Jawses, and by the, there's no way that many Jaws movies. I guess I don't know what they were thinking when they did that. If they actually thought that because at the time there were a lot of Jaws sequels, but did they really think that it was going to continue like that? And different things like the whole fax thing in the future. There's a lot of things that didn't come true, and I know there's been tons of like YouTube videos and things on Back to the Future, things that actually kind of happened and things that just were way off the mark. So if you're telling a story in the future, that's something to think about too, because your story can get dated really quick. But if you go super far in the future, or if it's in a different world in the future, or there's a lot of things you can do to avoid that as well. But just, something to think about, when your story takes place, what the time frame is of your story. The next thing we need to consider when world building is very important: people, the characters in our story. And there's a lot that's attached to the people. What languages they speak. And this all this stuff here that I'm talking about will tie in. So the time period will tie into probably a little bit into your characters, and some of the other things that I'm going to be talking about. It all ties in a little bit. So, what is the culture of the people in your story? Clothing, of course, this goes back to time as well. The era of the clothes that they're wearing or whatever. Or maybe you've got a person that's an outcast. Maybe he doesn't dress like the typical person in whatever time period you are. If this is a space adventure or a fantasy adventure, a lot of times we base that stuff on reality. If you look at Star Wars, some of the clothes they wear, I mean, some of it you can kind of see people wearing, like some of the human characters like Han Solo. I mean, there are definitely vests and certain things like that have been in style, but there's just the way like the belts are, and there's different like little attachments and little things like that repeats throughout. And so you can look at that and you can say, oh, that looks like a character from Star Wars, as opposed to maybe some other sci-fi fantasy story. But when talking about people, there are other things to consider, things like currency. What does their society use? You always want to think of the society in general. There's going to be certain factions and different traditions, different religions, and a lot of those things are going to create some conflict. Though if there are two different factions, warring factions and whatever, that, and you know, you've got one person on this side and another person on the opposing side, whether it's a belief system or whether it's a government or whether it's a different class systems, all that stuff comes into play, and that's something you want to consider when creating your characters. Now, the third thing I want to talk about before we actually get into a little bit of exercise in world building is the setting. Where does your story take place? Now, some people can pull this off really well as far as the setting feeling like almost like a character. Gotham City is a perfect example. When you think of Gotham City, it's almost like a character unto itself. It's just got a vibe to it. You know it's dark, it's gritty, it's kind of crime-ridden. So Gotham City is a really rich, well thought out location for a story to take place in. But just like your time frame and your characters, there are so many different options that you can go with. You don't have to have your story take place even on Earth. I mean, we can have a story take place in outer space, where you can really get into like the different landscapes, different planets, where you know, Star Wars does this thing where each planet kind of is like, there's a ice planet and there's a swamp planet and there's a forest planet, but it doesn't have to be like that. Planets can be like they are on Earth, where there's different environments on every planet. But that's something for you to dive into, whether it's based sort of on medieval type mythology like Middle Earth or Westeros, or it's more sci-fi fantasy like Pangaea from Avatar. I think the actual setting is something that's really fun once you start diving into and figuring out what this place where your characters inhabit, what it's all about. Now, when creators are world building and coming up with the ideas for their setting, one thing many of us do is we will create a map of our world. This is another one of those things you want to be careful not to get too bogged down into, but it is fun to kind of know what's going on in your world, how far away, like if there's a stronghold over here or there's a village over here, kind of what the distance is, are there mountains in between, the terrain, where the different settlements are and everything. With world building, we can take all these copious notes and everything, but I think it's a good idea to come up with a map if you've got a world and everything, just so you know where everything is and everything like that. Other things you want to consider: the environment, what's the weather like, or seasons, the history of your world, transportation, how do people get around? Are they getting around on like horses or spaceships or beams of light or gliders, or it could be anything. How do people get from point A to point B in your world? There's a lot of different things we can dive into with that. I mean, whether you're creating like this steampunk world where everything's steam powered, or you know, hydropower, or whatever you want to do, you can do it. This is your story. And along with that is also the technology. Where are we at with technology? I mean, if we have spaceships and things, then we're probably a little bit high tech, probably more than we are in our world. But if we're getting around on horse and carriages and things like that, then it's probably a little more primitive. So technology, you know, and there can be a mix of technology in the world. Maybe some people aren't as technologically advanced in your stories as other people, and maybe that could also be a conflict there. So these are all things to think about. If you guys have other ideas or things that I didn't mention that you think of when you're creating your worlds and everything, let me know in the comment section. So what I'd like to do is actually take you guys in real time and show you my process for world building for a sample story that I'm going to be working on for just this course. I've got an idea. It's just going to be a short story that I'm going to kind of do during this whole process of making comics. Nothing elaborate, because even though we're talking about world building and there's so many different ways we can go, I'm going to try to keep it simple to just like basically maybe like 3 characters, one single location, maybe like a 4-page story. I might not even get that far, but maybe I'll plan it out. And I just think it would be kind of cool just to show you how I do it. Now, everyone might go about this differently, but I think what I'm going to do is save that for a bonus episode, which will be coming up real soon on this channel, so stay tuned for that. Other than that, that's about all I've got as far as the structure for world building. After this bonus episode, the next episode we're going to do, I believe, is going to be plotting. So we'll talk about plotting in a little bit, but before that, we're going to show you a little bit of my world building process, and so until then, I will see you guys later, and that is all. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Also, you can follow me at Serkworks on social media, and now you can support the work that I do on Patreon. Do you like making comics? Then go to Serkworks.com and pick up the Comic Maker Starter Kit. It's packed full of fonts, brushes, templates, and more, and best of all, it's totally free.